Welcome to Old Testament 29. We're continuing on the book of Psalms. And so basically, what do the Psalms tell us? Now, if you just take the book and you open up and go through the 150 Psalms, you kind of say, this is not in any particular order. One psalm could be weeping and wailing, and the next psalm can be praising God. It says the psalmist doesn't have a care in the world. So what's going on? Why are they organized this way? Now we will spend some time talking about later the Psalter, but right now there is kind of a randomness in the Psalter, but you have to look at it not from our human perspective, not even in a sense from David's perspective, because some of it is post-David. It's kind of like in God's perspective. From our perspective, the collection of Psalms grew over time, and it seems that they were put into any order that would fit. That being said, there is a basic pattern to the Psalms when you step back and you look at them in terms of the big picture, the whole picture. And so the first thing to notice is that the Psalms are divided into 5 separate, we call them books. The first book of Psalms runs from Psalm 1 to Psalm 41. The second, 42 to 72. The third, 73 to 89. The fourth, 90 to 106. The fifth, 107 to 150. Now, these books vary in length. The first one is 41 Psalms long, the second 31, the third and fourth weigh in about 17 Psalms each, and the fifth is the longest with 54 Psalms. And I'm not going to give you a kind of statistic analysis, but some people have actually talked about the number of Psalms, the number of verses, the total number of words. And if you're into that, you can look it up. Because I'm not into stats, I'm into the stories. And what I find interesting about the Psalms is that each book has its own character. Book 1 really begins with Psalm 3, because Psalms 1 and 2 are probably a double introduction to the entire Psalter. Book 1 has a certain mood because of the highest concentration of lament psalms are found here. Most of these are individual laments, meaning that a single individual, usually David, is in deep trouble and crying out to God. So the mood of Book 1 is pretty low. And David usually is in a place of suffering from the beginning. O Lord, how many are my foes? Psalm 3, verse 1. To the end, even my bosom friend has lifted his heel against me. Psalm 41. Now, if you want to kind of take a look at it, it's kind of like from 1 to 41, David is going uphill. He's sad, and he's running from his enemies because that's his usual situation in Book 1. This changes in Book 2. However, Book 2 has a more confident tone. It has far fewer laments and many more psalms that end in an outright praise of God. We have for the first time psalms written by the choir leaders. David appointed the sons of Korah. See that in Psalms 42 to 49. Asapam. And see Psalm 50. We have a psalm describing a lavish royal wedding to a rich and gorgeous foreign princess. See Psalm 45. And the psalms that glorify David's beautiful capital of Jerusalem, 46 to 48. Most of all, Book 2 ends with a glorious description of the reign of Solomon. where everything goes right for Israel and Israel's king, Psalm 72. So, if things were going uphill in a sense that David is just getting beaten, I mean, now we have kind of like a glorious hill at the top with the king in his crown, uh, arms raised in the praise of God. Now, if book one was David as a suffering king, book two is David as a triumphant king, especially as he passes the leadership over to Solomon, and his son was seen as greater than he. Book 2 brings us to the highest emotional point in the Psalter. And we will get back to good positive emotions to Book 5. And that's because from its first psalm to its last, Book 3 has almost an entirely different mood than Book 2. Book 3 begins with a somewhat depressing psalm about how the wicked seem to prosper, while the righteous suffer. Example is Psalm 73. And it ends with the two most depressing psalms in the whole collection, 88 and 89. Book 3 has several communal laments in which the whole nation is in trouble. At the end of the book, Psalm 88 ends without any hope for the future, which is very rare for a psalm. And Psalm 89 ends with the king deposed from his throne and dragged into exile, and the kingdom in ruins. So now everything's in a sense going downhill. The Davidic king is sliding down and away and losing his crown. Book 3 ends with an emotional crash and the burn of Psalms 88 and 89. So where do you go from there when you're really at the bottom of everything? Well, you step back and reflect on what happened and why. And that is the mood of Book 4. Book 4 is the most meditative and reflective book of the Psalter. It begins with a melancholy psalm from Moses about how short and sorrowful life is. And it ends with two psalms that review Israel's history, Psalms 105 and 106, and point out how many mistakes Israel made. David almost disappears from Book 4. It's mentioned only twice. And then there's very little about the Davidic king. The book ends with a prayer for God to bring the people back from exile, Psalm 106, especially verse 47. So we can see the mood of Book 4 is a bit flat. It's as if the psalmist is in exile, reflecting on why is that kingdom of David collapsed. He turns his thoughts to God's kingdom rather than the earthly kingdom, Psalms 93 to 99, and prays for God to restore his people, Psalm 106, verse 47. And he doesn't stay that way for very long. The mood changes immediately when we get into Book 5. If Book 4 ended with a psalm for God to bring his people back from exile, once again Psalm 106, verse 47, Book 5 begins with thanking God for bringing his people back, Psalm 107, verses 2 through 3. Clearly, the time of exile is over, and Book 5 includes several psalms that were written once the people of Judah had come back to their land and rebuilt their city and temple in the 5 and 400 BCs. See Psalm 126. At the heart of Book 5 is a collection of Psalms of Ascent, written for the pilgrimage up to Jerusalem and the temple. It ends with the biggest firework finale of praise in the whole of the Psalter, the 5 very famous Hallelujah Psalms, 146, 147, 148, 149, 150. Through all this, there is a strong theme of giving praise to God in his temple, So for book 5, it's, once again that upward, going up the hill and getting to the top of the hill, and the temple is at the top of the hill. Um, so kind of like you get going up, but you're running away from enemies, reaching the Davidic king, and then going down, and then a little flat land there, and then going up. That's kind of what the okay. All right, let's see if I get it here. Going the other way, maybe with the other hand. No, I get it now. And so we can see that this is the basic story of David and his descendants. David begins his career as a servant of Saul, was kicked out of the palace, and lived most of his youth on the run as an outlaw fleeing from his enemies. Book 1. At midlife, David suddenly finds himself as king of Israel and established Jerusalem, the strongest city in the whole country, as his capital. There he achieved great success, and his son Solomon even more so. Book 2. After Solomon, however, the kingdom rapidly declines from the mid 900s BC onward as the nation is invaded and grew weaker and weaker until the destruction and exile at the hands of the Babylonians in 587 BCE. Then the royal court and all the people with them spent about 50 to 60 years, about 597 to 587, and to about 537. So starting roughly 597, 587, and it didn't happen all at once, and then going to about 537. They spent in an exile in Babylon with nothing to do but think about what they had done and how it had gotten all so wrong. Finally, around 587, God put an end to the Babylonian exile and let his people return to the land. The late 500s and 400s, before the Common Experience, BCE, were busy times as the Jews came back to Jerusalem and rebuilt their temple and their city. They were grateful to God, and hope was high, and that the final golden age of Israel was about to dawn. Key element, we've talked about this before. Remember, since it's talking about this, what is now missing when they come back out of exile? What they're missing is a Davidic king, because there was no king in the line of David on the throne. Now, although the people had their temple back, they did not have their king. They were still awaiting him, the son of David, the Christos, the anointed one, the Messiah. And that's the way the book of Psalms ends, with great thanksgiving and hope, but still waiting for the Messiah to come. In that sense, for Christians, the Psalms anticipate Jesus. In Judaism, it's a different kind of anticipation, more of a universal participation. In any event, that's a quick tour of the basic story of the Psalms, the story of the kingdom of David, and the rest of this book. We'll look at the chapter on the first 2 introductory Psalms, Psalms 1 and 2, and then a chapter on each of the 5 books. We'll finish up with tips on reading for the Psalms for personal and spiritual growth. Sorry. So, introducing the Psalter. And as I said, this seems to be a double beginning, because this book of poems has not one but 2 introductions, Psalms 1 and 2. These psalms look as if they were placed at the beginning of the collection purposely to cue the reader on what to expect. We call the first psalm the Wisdom Introduction, the second psalm the Royal Introduction, wisdom. Wisdom, of course, is more related to the Ten Commandments. God's law, God's royal son. But let's look closely at Psalm 1. Psalm 1 is about a wise man who meditates on God's law and so gains life. Now, in the rest of this book, and I'm not going to usually take whole Psalms, just several verses. And it'll be up to you to read the full Psalm in your Bible. However, since Psalm 1 is short, very important, and kicks things off, I'll quote it in full. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is the law of his Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, that yields its fruit in its seasons, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff, which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. The idea that there are basically two paths in life. God's way that leads to life, and the world's way that leads to death. Now that's not a new theme. You've kind of seen it in other sections of the Bible, and it's especially true when we talk about the Bible's wisdom books. So that's why it's classified as a wisdom psalm. The opening verse has a pattern. Stand and sit with sinners. This is a progression. The foolish person gets gradually more comfortable with the wicked. First he just runs into them while walking down the road. Then he stops and stands around talking to them. Finally he sits down to a meal and really starts hanging out with them. One thing leads to another until he is just another wicked man himself. The righteous person is not like that. He thinks about God's law all the time. For us in our day, this would kind of mean meditating on Scripture, some memorization, kind of like, what would Jesus do? Well, Jesus would live according to the Psalms, that idea. So we need to know what the Psalms are saying and meditate upon them. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, verse 3. This is the image of a tree of life in the Garden of Eden, which was planted by 4 streams. See Genesis 2, verses 9 and 10. This means that pondering God's law will take you back to the state of peace and happiness our first parents enjoyed with God, that leads to life and prosperity. But the fate of the evil is different. Like dried up vegetation, blown away by the wind, God doesn't know their way, but he knows the way of the righteous, which means he watches over the way of the righteous. So Psalm 1 promises blessings and God's favor on the person who meditates on God's law. By beginning the Psalter in this way, in Psalm 1 suggests that somehow the whole Psalter is a book about walking according to God's law and his ways. However, this seems a little bit strange because once we get into the Psalter, we realize it does not contain laws like Deuteronomy, nor does it contain instructions like Proverbs. Instead, it is full of prayers, praises, and worship. So how is the Psalter a book about living according to God's law? The answer is this: the life according to God's law is a life of prayer and worship. God calls, excuse me, God's laws really aim to guide us into a relationship with God. And the Psalter shows us how that relationship with Him at every moment, whether mood or situation we find ourselves, whether happy or sad, whether in success or defeat. More than a psalm that fits your mood, whatever it may be, and that you can pray back to God, is the situation you find yourself in. The Psalter shows us how to walk according to God's law in an indirect way. David doesn't give us laws as Moses did, nor tips for having or living like Solomon, but David shares his own life with us and shows us how to keep up our relationship with God in every or any different situation. Along the way, we learn the virtues and traits of the wise man, the righteous man. It takes time, but as you walk the path, things come to you, you incorporate them, and you become wise, and then everything is open to you. Psalm 2 is very different from Psalm 1. Here, the focus is no longer on God's law, but on God's Son, the King. Key verses. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? To clean my glasses. He who sits in the heavens laughs, then he will speak to them in his wrath. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill, but I will tell the decree of the Lord. But he said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possessions. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling respite. Anyone who does not. Let me go back. Where did I leave off? Psalm 2 is, I'll start all over. Sorry about that, I got distracted. Here the focus is no longer on God's law, but on God's Son, the King. Key excerpt. Why do the nations compare and the peoples plot in vain? He who sits in the heavens laughs, then he will speak to them in his wrath. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possessions. Serve the Lord with fear, and with trembling rejoice. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Psalm 2 ends with a blessing, just like Psalm 1. Psalm 2 ends with a blessing. Psalm 1 began, whose delight is the law of the Lord, where Psalm 2 says, blessed are all who take refuge in him. Both Psalms are about blessings, but they present two different paths to it. The background for Psalm 2 is the Davidic kingdom and the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. We read about how God took David into a father-son relationship with himself called the covenant. And as part of the covenant, he promised David and his sons kingship over the whole earth. during their own lifetimes. David and Solomon ruled over not just Israel, but all the surrounding nations as well. You see that from 2 Samuel 10 to 1 Kings 4. The background of the psalm: the surrounding nations don't want to serve David and Solomon anymore, and they plan to rebel. But that won't work, because God promised David and his son the kingship by divine decree. If the nations want blessings and prosperity, they should submit to God and the king. Submit to God and the king, and not rebel. So verse 7 is important. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. The word used for decree here can be a synonym for covenant. This is a statement of the Davidic covenant. A covenant is a family relationship sealed by an oath. In this case, God swears to David and his sons to be a father to them. We call that a filial relationship, or divine sonship. We too enjoy a filial relationship with God, because we are united to Christ and he is God's Son. Psalm 2 is one of the most important psalms of the New Testament, possibly the most important. For example, at Jesus' baptism and at the Transfiguration in the Gospels, two absolutely pivotal events in the life of Jesus. We hear the voice of God, the Father, from heaven, basically restating verse 7. This is my beloved Son. Matthew 3:17 and 17:5. Then before his ascension, Jesus gives the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Matthew 28 verses 18 and 19. This is clearly based on Psalm 2, which promises all royal authority to the Son of David, including the rule over the nations. Psalm 2 continues to be important in the early church. You see it in Acts 4, verses 23 through 31. We find the apostles and the early believers are faced with severe persecutions. So they pray Psalm 2 back to God the Father, and the Spirit is sent in power, shaking the place where they are praying. There are many other references to Psalm 2 in the New Testament, but this is the basic idea. In Psalm 2, God promises kingship over the world to the Son of David. And in the New Testament, God makes good on that promise. He gives Jesus, Son of God, Son of David, the kingship over the world. That is the gospel. This way to blessing, this way to eternal life, is to take refuge in Jesus. So let's talk about the last line of Psalm 2, using the more common translation, the New Revised Standard Version, which reads, serve the Lord with fear, with trembling kiss his feet, or he will be angry and you will perish, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are those who take refuge in him. Who's the him in whom we should take refuge? For most modern translations, it is the Lord, because they translate verse 12 as kiss his feet. But the Hebrew literally says at verse 12, kiss the Son. And so it is that the Son might get angry, and the Son in whom you should take refuge. Most scholars think the word Son is a mistake in verse 12, so they correct it to something else. But others feel it is appropriate. You need to kiss the Son, that is to say, the Son of David, the King of Israel, and take refuge in him. For us, this is Jesus, Son of David, in whom we seek refuge. Psalm 2 is like Psalm 1, is that It's an introduction to the Psalter. But if Psalm 1 suggested that the Psalter was a book about God's law, Psalm 2 suggests the Psalter is a book about the Messiah, the royal son of David, who is also the Son of God. Actually, both are true. The Psalter is about the law of God and is also about the Son of God, the Messiah. In fact, later in the Bible, the Gospel of John will show us that the two are the same. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John will say in 1:14. That is the law of God, His Word. Took flesh and became a man, Jesus Christ, Son of David. So the law and the Son became the same thing. Psalm 1 promises blessings for following God's law. Psalm 2 promises blessing for taking refuge in the royal Son. In hindsight, we can see the two end up amounting to the same thing. And, so it all comes together. And it is a word of hope. Next time we will talk about book 1 of the Psalms, but I hope that you're getting to appreciate some of them. Sorry I'm not doing so well today, but I got kind of rushed and got kind of distracted, and unfortunately with my new schedule I don't have the time to redo it as I would have normally done, so I apologize to you. And as you go through the Psalms, for those of you who don't like poetry, kind of look at the message. Now that you've seen the big picture of the book of Psalms, you can tie it in with some of your emotional feelings, but you can also see it in light of the big picture, whether you're a Christian or a Jew. The big picture of the scriptures is right there for a very important segment in the Psalms. So I hope you're getting something out of it, and I hope that you are finding spiritual solace. I mean, the Psalms are something that we continue to use as Christians and as Jews. They are used constantly in our prayer life. And so to have a more rewarding prayer life, I hope and pray that you're getting something from these Psalms. May God bless you and keep you.